After decades of simmering tensions over slavery, states' rights, and westward expansion between northern and southern states, the American Civil War broke out in 1861. 7 southern states formed the Confederate States of America after Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860. 4 additional states soon joined them. Confederate surrender in 1865 marked the conclusion of the Civil War, also known as the War Between the States. With over 620,000 of the 2.4 million soldiers killed, millions more hurt, and a large portion of the South in ruins, the fight was the most expensive and lethal combat ever waged on American territory. There was a basic economic divide between the northern and southern parts of the country in the middle of the 19th century. Even though the country was going through a period of rapid growth, agriculture in the north was primarily restricted to small-scale farms, and manufacturing and industry were well established, but the South's economy was based on a system of large-scale farming that depended on the work of black slaves, particularly for the cultivation of cotton and tobacco. Many Southerners believed that the continuation of slavery in America, and hence the foundation of their economy, was in jeopardy as a result of growing abolitionist sentiment in the North following the 1830s and Northern hostility to slavery's expansion into the new Western territories. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was passed by the U.S. Congress in 1854 and effectively allowed slavery in all new territories, established the supremacy of popular sovereignty over congressional decree. As opposition to the practice in the North resulted in the founding of the Republican Party, a new political organization founded on the principle of opposing slavery's development into the Western territories, pro- and anti-slavery groups engaged in deadly conflict in Bleeding, Kansas. Following the Supreme Court's decision in the Dr. Scott case 1857, which upheld slavery's legitimacy in the territories, John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry in 1859 persuaded an increasing number of Southerners that their northern neighbors were determined to abolish the peculiar institution that had sustained them. After Abraham Lincoln's victory in the election in November 1860, 7 southern states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, separated from the Union within 3 months. Confederate soldiers were posing a threat to the federally held Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, even as Lincoln assumed office in March 1861. The Civil War began on April 12, when Confederate artillery fired its opening salvos after Lincoln gave the order for a fleet to resupply Sumter. After fewer than 2 days of bombardment, Major Robert Anderson, the fort's commander, capitulated, handing control of the fort over to Pierre G&T Beauregard and the Confederate soldiers. Following Fort Sumter, 4 more southern states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, joined the Confederacy. Border slave states like Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland did not secede, but a large portion of their populace supported the Confederacy. Despite the fact that the 23 states of the Union appeared to have had a huge edge in population, manufacturing, including the production of armaments, and railroad building, the Confederates had a solid military heritage and some of the best troops and commanders in the country. The preservation of their long-standing customs and institutions, prominent among them slavery, was another cause they were committed to. A larger number of Union forces or Federals were forced to flee toward Washington, D.C. on July 21, 1861, in the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as First Manassas in the South. This ended any hopes of a quick Union victory and prompted Lincoln to issue a call for 500,000 more recruits. In fact, as it became evident that the war would not be a small or brief fight, both sides' initial demand for troops had to be expanded. Virginia during the Civil War 1862. Lincoln was frustrated by George B.N. McClellan's reluctance to advance even though his troops adored him. McClellan succeeded the ailing General Winfield Scott as Supreme Commander of the Union Army after the first few months of the war. McClellan's Army of the Potomac ultimately advanced up the peninsula between the York and James Rivers in the spring of 1862, taking Yorktown on May 4. During the 7 days battles, June 25, July 1, Robert E. Lee and Andrew Jackson's combined forces successfully repulsed McClellan's army. A wary McClellan then requested additional reinforcements before moving against Richmond. Lincoln declined, bringing the Army of the Potomac to Washington instead. McClellan had been superseded as the top Union general by mid-1862, even though he was still in charge of the Army of the Potomac by Henry W. Halleck. Afterwards, Lee divided his army and pushed his troops north, sending Jackson to meet Pope's forces close to Manassas while he went separately with the other half of the army. At the Second Battle of Bull Run on August 29th, Union troops under John Pope attacked Jackson's forces' 2nd Manassas. The next day, Lee launched a major assault against the Federal left flank, forcing Pope's men to retreat in the direction of Washington. Following his success at Manassas, Lee launched the first Confederate invasion of the North. On September 14th in Maryland, McClellan was able to reassemble his army, attack Lee, and drive the Confederates back to a defensive position along Antietam Creek, close to Sharpsburg, despite conflicting orders from Lincoln and Halleck. The Army of the Potomac attacked Lee's men on September 17th, who had been bolstered by Jackson's forces, beginning the deadliest single day of combat in the whole conflict. Overall casualties at the Battle of Antietam, also known as the Battle of Sharpsburg, were 12,410 of the Union's about 69,000 soldiers and 13,724 of the Confederates' approximately 52,000 soldiers. The Confederate march in Maryland was stopped by the Union victory at Antietam, which also compelled Lee to return into Virginia. But Lincoln and Halleck scorned McClellan for not acting on his advantage, and they replaced him as commander with Ambrose E. Burnside. Burnside was quickly replaced by Joseph, fighting Joe Hooker, and both armies established winter quarters across the Rappahannock River from one another after Burnside's assault on Lee's troops near Fredericksburg on December 13th resulted in significant Union fatalities and a Confederate triumph. Lincoln had issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on the occasion of the Union's victory at Antietam, freeing all slaves in the rebellious states as of January 1, 1863. He did not go as far as to free the enslaved people in the border states that were loyal to the Union, but he did defend his choice as a necessary wartime action. Yet, the Emancipation Proclamation stripped the Confederacy of the majority of its labor force and firmly positioned the Union as the superior side in the eyes of the world. By the time the Civil War concluded in 1865, about 186,000 African troops had enlisted in the Union Army, and 38,000 of them had died. Hooker's plans for a Union offensive in the spring of 1863 were derailed by a surprise attack by the majority of Lee's forces on May 1st. Hooker then withdrew his troops to Chancellorsville. In the Battle of Chancellorsville, the Confederates won at great cost, losing 13,000 soldiers, or about 22% of their army. The Union lost 17,000 soldiers, 15%. By attacking Union forces led by General George Meade on July 1st near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Lee started a second invasion of the North in June. In 3 days of furious fighting, the Confederates lost close to 60% of their soldiers but were unable to break through the Union corps. Meade failed to counterattack, however, and Lee's remaining forces were able to escape into Virginia, ending the last Confederate invasion of the North. Also in July 1863, Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant took Vicksburg, Mississippi in the Siege of Vicksburg, a victory that would prove to be the turning point of the war in the Western Theater. Following a Confederate success in September at Chickamauga Creek, Georgia, south of Chattanooga, Tennessee, Lincoln enlarged Grant's command, and in late November Grant oversaw a bolstered Federal army which included 2 corps from the Army of the Potomac as it won the Battle of Chattanooga. Lincoln replaced Halleck as the top commander of the Union Army in March 1864 and appointed Grant. Grant left William Tecumseh Sherman in charge of operations in the West and moved on to Washington, where he commanded the Army of the Potomac as it approached Lee's forces in Northern Virginia. Grant pursued an attrition strategy, putting Petersburg under siege for the following 9 months despite significant Union losses in the Battle of the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, at Cold Harbor, and at the crucial rail center of Petersburg, all in June 1864, which occurred despite heavy Union losses in May 1864. By outsmarting Confederate forces, Sherman managed to seize Atlanta by September. From there, he and about 60,000 Union soldiers launched the infamous March to the Sea, which ravaged Georgia on its way to seizing Savannah on December 21st. By the middle of February, Sherman's troops had taken Charleston and Columbia, South Carolina, and Jefferson Davis had finally relinquished supreme authority to Robert E. Lee, the Confederate war effort nearing its end. By the middle of April, Sherman had advanced across North Carolina, taking Fayetteville, Bentonville, Goldsboro, and Raleigh. These men made one more effort at resistance while under the Union's siege of Petersburg and Richmond on March 25th, attacking and taking control of the Federal-controlled Fort Stedman. However, a swift assault undid the triumph, and on the night of April 2nd, the Third Lee's army left Richmond. Grant and Meade pursued the Confederates along the Appomattox River for the majority of the following week, ultimately eliminating all of their escape options. On April 9th, Grant acknowledged Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. The Union lost its great leader just before victory. On April 14th, actor and Confederate supporter John Wilkes Booth killed President Lincoln at Washington's Ford's Theater. The Civil War was officially over when Sherman accepted Johnston's surrender at Durham Station, North Carolina, on April 26th.